Hey guys, so I made a couple videos yesterday going over subs, and then after I finished those videos, I kind of thought about some more topics and ideas to also go over in addition to those videos. So one thing is an overhung or an underhung sub design. What's the difference? What does that mean? I want to go, which that'll lead into control of the subwoofer, which is geared towards an SQ subwoofer, which can lead into dampening, which goes into your amplifier, and that's all in relation to your motor strength. I want to talk about displacement, and I'm going to go into detail with like a W7, because I feel like a W7 and JL just overall is kind of misunderstood. Inductance. How well does your sub transition across frequencies? I want to explain, yesterday I explained about how you look at the specs, the sub should be ran ported or be ran stilled, but why? Why is that? I want to point out and show the way as you go up in size from a 10 to a 12 to a 15 to an 18, how the FS and the QTS changes in relation to the size of that woofer. And then I want to go into discussion about 8-inch subs and why I don't like to see them ran in fourth orders. Personal preference. And motor size. Yes, size differences. This is interesting. I bet most people don't even recognize this. All right. Overhung is your most common woofers, and what that means, I got an image up here to show it better than I can explain. This over here is your overhung, and this means that part of the coil is going to be outside the gap, parts in. As this travels back and forth, it's going to leave the gap. So when you're talking about control over your cone and your subwoofer, from the motor strength, you're going to be losing some of that strength as the coil leaves the gap and as it comes back. Now, companies say like a DD will have a supercharged sub. They add an extended pole piece. Some of the Sundown subs and other brands and stuff, like on their team motors and all that, actually have an extended pole piece that goes up, so that way even though the coil is leaving the sides of the magnet here, it still is getting the magnetic force from that pole piece. So that's an overhung, and that's most of your subs. And the reason why is because they tend to be higher powered, and so by them to leave the gap, it allows them to cool off better. Underhung is more of your SQ, because when you talk about motor strength, you're also talking about, you can be talking about SPL goals, but then motor strength is also going to help control that cone and that sub, which can be a sound quality benefit as well. And so an underhung is going to keep the coil inside the gap. And since you're keeping the coil inside the gap, then it's going to maintain a lot better control over that sub, because the coil is not leaving the gap. And so there's not a lot of underhung designs out there. I know that Sundown does have a couple. I know that they were working on an SQ sub, but yeah, so some of your SQ brands will do an underhung design. And so that's the difference, is about control and cooling. So that leads into this. Dampening is also a matter of control, and that has to do with your amplifier. And generally, the higher the impedance you wire at, say 4 ohm versus 1 ohm, just to kind of give a really simple explanation, the higher the dampening, you're allowing the amplifier to control your sub rather than your sub controlling your amplifier. Because as you're presenting a load to the amplifier, it's presenting power to that sub. But as we know, that sub moves and plays, and then you can get some back feed into the amplifier. And if the amp can't control the back feed coming into it, then the sub is controlling your amp. Your amp isn't controlling the sub. So if you're just going for numbers and you're running at 1 ohm or half ohm or quarter ohm, and you're just going for sheer output, that's really not going to matter to you. If you want precise, crisp, good bass, dampening is going to matter to you. Now, the sub in the enclosure is going to have the biggest impact over the control over that woofer, but your amp is going to play a part in that because it is what's driving your sub. Displacement. All right, we talked yesterday briefly about the cone area of a sub and how far it's traveling, its excursion. If you look up the specs, and I used to like to use the FIBL, the FISSD 18-inch subs. You know, common sub, well-known brand. If you compare an 18-inch FIBL SSD to a JL13W7, the 18s do have a little bit more displacement, but not a whole lot. If you factor how far this 13W7 is traveling, I believe it's 32 millimeters. It might be 33 millimeters, somewhere around there. I haven't looked up the exact number in a while. But it's just a fact of that. This is a 13.5-inch cone, and it's traveling very, very far. So it's moving a lot of air. Not just about cone size, but also displacement of how far it's traveling. And these have a 20, I don't know, maybe even 18, 20 millimeter excursion. So it's a fact that there's more cone area here, but it's not traveling as far, whereas this is a little bit smaller cone area, but it's traveling further, so it has more overall displacement. And why would that benefit? Why would that matter to somebody? Well, if you had a smaller trunk and you were only able to fit, say, a 3 cubic foot enclosure, ported, net, 3 cubes, and you want to get the most output you can out of that space, well, you can't run a ported 18 in 3 cubic foot. It's not enough space. You would need at least 6 cubic foot, give or take, which is twice the volume that you don't have. But you could run a ported JL13W7 in that space and get damn near the same displacement as this 18. That's where they shine. They are able to produce a lot of displacement in a much smaller footprint. Doesn't make them an SPL sub, doesn't make them the best sub on the market, but if you run them for what they were meant for, one of what they were meant for, they do well. So that's one of my beefs with people hating on JL and W7s is they don't always understand what they're designed to do. All right, inductance. W7 could be a good example of that too. Inductance is how well can your sub change frequencies. You're playing music and you're hitting a bass note at 30 hertz and all of a sudden 45 hertz. All of a sudden 35 hertz. All of a sudden 50 hertz. Does your sub change that quick, or is it kind of slow and sluggish and sloppy, and thus what a muddy sound comes from? If your sub, which can be based on running at a half ohm versus running at a 4 ohm or an 8 ohm load because of dampening and control over that sub, but also the sub itself, how it's designed, what it's meant to do, you know, like an SPL sub. And if you watch that guy that does the bear vids, if you look through his videos, he actually did a great video going over this. He actually mic'd a lot of different subs, and he showed just how choppy and distorted certain subs were versus others, which had to do with inductance. How well can your sub change frequency and then transition across the board, and just how musical can that sub be? Maybe that matters to you, maybe it doesn't. It depends on your goals. All right, why ported and why sealed? Sub that has lower motor strength, which we said is a high QTS and a low EBP, has lower motor strength, sealed. And that's because they are going to benefit from the added support of that sealed enclosure, of that springiness of the volume. Now, can Now, some subs are strictly meant just to be ran sealed, yes. But typically, if a sub is more sealed friendly, it can be ran ported, typically because of the lower motor strength, and it depends on how much power you're showing that sub. But typically, if it's more sealed friendly and you want to run ported, you can. Typically, they work in a little bit larger ported enclosure, maybe a little bit more port area. Typically, they have a larger VAS, VAS, one of the specs that's on your parameters. Typically, they have a larger VAS, and they will typically, if you want to work in a sealed enclosure, but then you want to do ported, typically they're going to be a little bit larger in volume. All right, ported. Now, this is a higher motor strength sub, and then we were saying some subs have a 0.3 QTS and 100 plus EBP, super strong motor force. A ported enclosure is typically larger in volume than a sealed enclosure. And so you might be thinking, well, if a sub has a lot more motor strength, why do you run a bigger box? Well, you also incorporate into this enclosure a port. And so what you're creating is a pressured chamber that you're forcing air in and out of. So as your sub moves back and forth, air is traveling in and out of this enclosure. And so because you're now loading a chamber and you're forcing a given amount of air, of volume, in and out of this box, it takes a lot more force and strength to move that air in and out of that box, especially if you're doing a sixth order. Because now the rear of the sub is working in a loaded chamber through a port, and the front of that sub is working through a loaded chamber, forcing out through a port. So this is why a ported friendly sub is going to be one to be ran ported, because of motor strength, because the ported enclosure adds support for that sub that it needs. If you ran a sub with high motor strength in a sealed enclosure, it's going to overextend if you ran rated power, especially overrated power. So then what's going to happen is you would have to decrease the power the sub could see because it's in that sealed box, which running sealed is going to make it quieter, period, and then you reduce power. That's going to defeat the purpose of running that sub in the first place. Now, you might be wondering, people do in walls and stuff in their SUVs do run subs with higher motor strength in a fourth order. Well, typically they're running many subs, 8, 12 subs. And so if you reduce the sealed volume to a point to where it will support that sub, and then because you're running so many of those subs, it makes up for that loss in the low end that you're losing by running sealed in the fourth install. And then the ported chamber of that fourth order is then benefiting from that motor strength. So you can, in that kind of application, run these subs. Many people do. There's videos every single day of it. But if you're just doing an install in your vehicle, if it's meant to be ran ported, run it ported. It's not going to be happy, and it's not going to do well. It's not going to sound good sealed. All right. One thing people may not know and notice is when you go up in size in your woofers, and I'm using DC level 4 here for example. All right, 18 inch, 15 inch, 12 inch, 10 inch. As you go up in size of the woofer, you will notice that your QTS goes up, which makes it more and more sealed friendly as it goes up in size, more and more ported friendly as it goes down in size. FS, frequency response, also goes down as the cone area goes up. This is because you have more and more moving mass, less and less moving mass. The frequency response goes up. So this also relates to an 8-inch sub, which I want to get into. Alright, so 8s, as I've talked about, if you have a QTS that's lower, and you have an FS that's really high, and a fourth order enclosure, which of course is sealed and ported, If your sub has a really high FS, say in the 40 hertz range, it's probably not going to get very low sealed. Also, especially nowadays, all these really beefy 8s coming out are awesome. They are absolute beasts. Bigger and bigger motors, stiffer and stiffer spiders, stronger and stronger voice coils, 1000 RMS and more power handling. They're awesome. Problem is that as we've talked about motor strength and higher power rated and, a higher FS, all of those are not fourth order friendly. And so you take these 8s and you put them in a fourth order, probably not going to sound all that good if you want to get low. If you want to get loud, sure. If you want to have a daily response and you want to sound good, really not a good idea. You also got to think about cone area. You're running this 8. How much displacement is that 8 really going to make? If you want to have good low end with an 8, run it ported. 6th order. Transmission line. Would not recommend a 4th order. Just would not. Higher FS, higher motor strength. Wouldn't recommend it. So, why does that happen when you go up in size? Well, I said moving mass, but one thing, and this is DC, but a lot of other brands do this. They run the same size motor on the 10, on the 12, on the 15, on the 18. Thus, the same power handling, same motor weight. If you look at a company like JL, doesn't matter if you're comparing the W6 line, W3 line, W7 line, as you go up to a larger size, from the 10 to the 12 to the 13 and a half, the motor size also increases. They don't just keep running the same size motor. That's a JL difference too. And, I'm a fan of JL, but, every sub has their place in the market. But I'm just trying to point out some stuff that people may not realize. Running a bigger motor is for a reason. They're doing that, They could have kept the same general size motor and saved money in production and kept the same size motor for all subs through the board. But they chose to increase due to the increased cone size, which helps keep that motor strength. Because that's what W7 and JL really is meant for, is sound quality. And just how I said that the motor strength can be used for SPL, it can also be used for the sound quality aspect. And so they increase motor strength from the motor size to also compensate and help control that larger cone, that greater excursion. So that's one thing to think about as well when it comes to subs and the differences in subs and what's out there on the market. So hopefully this helps to share some additional content for you guys about subwoofers and helps maybe shed some more light on some stuff for you. Alright guys, thanks for watching.